The ASX heads towards a new record. Airfares jumped 12% since Rex's collapse, and fears escalate about the side effects of weight loss wonder drugs. Welcome to Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. It is Tuesday, the 17th of September 2024. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, the main story this morning, the local share market is on the cusp of hitting a new record with confidence about the Australian and global economies pushing markets higher, even though interest rates remain relatively high.
It is the market that keeps on giving. Yesterday, it got to 3 points of the all-time peak from August before closing up 0.3% to 8,122 points. 8,148 points is the number the market needs to hit. Since a sell-off 6 weeks ago, the bourse is up more than 6%. For this year, 2024, it's up 7% and nearly 12% for the past 52 weeks. Now, it's up 70% since its COVID slump. That's a pretty good run. While all the economic news from China seems to be bad, including data over the weekend, the fact that European and North American central banks are or will cut interest rates is the dominant driver of the local market, even if the Reserve Bank isn't going to cut rates this year. It's been a good run. Mind you, analysts are warning there's still plenty to be worried about. Valuations of some stocks, notably the banks, are very high. September often is a poor month for the market. And as economic data comes in, any noticeable slowing could trigger fears of a recession either overseas or locally. Then there's geopolitical risks from the US election to the Middle East crisis and the war in Europe. The good news is inflation is definitely slowing and central banks are cutting rates.
Sean, you mentioned before the banks, and we've spoken so much about the banks doing well, and we've talked about the resources sector underperforming. But outside of those two areas, who are the winners and who are the losers over the past year? I don't mean to kind of group people into winners and losers, but let's do it anyway.
You are. Yeah. So starting with the winners, there's been some big ones. Goodman Group is up 57% over the past year on the back of demand for data centers, while WiseTech Global, which produces tracking software for parcels, is up a whopping 91%. Pretty incredible and way better than most of the banks. In fact, way better than all of the banks. Healthcare group ResMed has also had a great run, up 60% over the past year. Fisher & Paykel Healthcare, it's up nearly 80%. But the best of all, at least among the top 50, has been Pro Medicus, the medical imaging company. It's up 120%. That is quite a phenomenal run. The worst outside the resources stocks, and we're calling energy giant Woodside, which is down 37%, a resource stock, include Woolies, which is off 7%, and pathology group Sonic Healthcare, which is really still suffering from a COVID hangover. Sonic Healthcare really is the exception to the rule there because other healthcare companies, ResMed, Fisher & Paykel, have done really well, the data center guys, and certainly tech.
All right, so that's over the last year. What about specifically yesterday? We're going from the big picture down to a very specific, just one day.
Yeah, well, gives us an opportunity to talk about the banks.
Oh, at last.
Look, as I said, the market ended up a little bit to 8,122 points. Westpac led the banks, jumping another 2%. It's up 50% over the past 12 months, Westpac. NAB and Commonwealth Bank also did well. Woolies, REA, Brambles and Suncorp, they all rose. Not so good with the big miners, Woodside and CSL. In corporate news, mining company Alcoa share price jumped 5.5% after announcing plans to sell 25.1%. Well, that's the stake it owns in the Madden joint venture to its partner, the Saudi Arabian mining company, for about $1.6 billion. Defense shipbuilder Austal surged 20% after winning a $450 million contract with General Dynamics Electric Boat to expand production capacity in Alabama. Property group Lendlease rallied 2% on news it had completed the sale of its US East Coast construction operations. Mineral Resources came out, released a bullish estimate of possible gas resources in its Lockyer gas project in Western Australia's Perth Basin. Its share price was flat. Then online retailer Cettire dropped sharply on reports that Washington is considering reducing duty-free thresholds. And finally, Auckland International Airport will raise 1.3 billion Aussie dollars in an effort to kickstart major upgrades.
A fair bit of corporate news around, wasn't there?
Yeah, nothing huge, but lots of bits and pieces. The Auckland International Airport was an interesting one because there's just not that many infrastructure plays in Australia now. I mean, Sydney Airport obviously has left the bourse, but so have a lot of energy and other infrastructure assets. And so there were plenty of large investors keen to take part in that Auckland International Airport raising yesterday.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. What about international markets? What's going on?
BHP had a bit to say on copper, a commodity considered a bellwether for the economy. CFO Vandita Pant told the Financial Times that the growth of artificial intelligence will exacerbate a looming shortage of copper. The rise of data centers and AI, which requires more energy-intensive computing, could boost global copper demand by about 3.4 million tonnes a year by 2050. At the moment, data centers are less than 1% of copper demand. BHP reckons that'll go to about 6 or 7% by 2050. Meanwhile, oil prices are creeping higher, as is the Aussie dollar, which is now trading around 67.3 US cents.
Speaking of oil prices, Sean, today's episode, our bonus episode of Ask Fear and Greed, it is a cracker. So this is the short little episode that comes out at about midday, and it answers the questions of listeners. If you have a question, send it on through, and we'll do our best to answer it. But we really kind of planted this one, didn't we? We talked about oil last week, and I said I want to know about other types of oil, and you said I'm not doing the research unless somebody actually asks it. And sure enough, within an hour of that podcast going live, the first request came through.
It did. I know. It's fun. And the funny thing is, the more I looked into this, the sillier I felt for not knowing the answer.
That's, look, I mean, I'm not going to pass judgment on you for not knowing the answer to something.
You will.
Well, stick around. It is coming out at midday. It is a fantastic look, not just at kind of Brent crude, but a whole bunch of different types of oil, where the names come from, why the prices move, all that kind of stuff. So make sure you're following the podcast so that one lobs into your playlist at midday. In the meantime, we'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, domestic economy airfares have jumped 12% since the demise of Rex, while Qantas has increased the cost of changing a ticket by 20%.
Figures from the Bureau of Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Economics for September show that the cheapest airfares are up 12.5% since July, and full-price tickets are 12.3% more expensive. Business class airfares are relatively stable over recent months, but are 12% higher than a year ago. The monthly domestic airfare index showed full-price economy fares were now at their highest level in over 3 years at 93.6% of the long-term average. That means they're still a little bit cheap. That compared to 98.4% in February 2021. Best discount fares were at 70% of the long-term average compared to 57.5% 2 months ago. It comes as Qantas has upped the cost of changing a ticket from $99 to $120. There, when you change things because of your name or date of travel or cancellation of a ticket or something like that.
That does feel very expensive, considering it is all very much an online digital process now, right?
Yeah, and it depends what type of fare you buy, of course, because you can buy a fare with no changes, and I don't actually mind it that much because I don't know, I have to think about that one.
Yeah. Well, maybe it'll be something that you will tee off on in the Fear and Greed weekly newsletter out tomorrow. Head along to fearandgreed.com.au and subscribe if you haven't already done so. Sean, we're 2 weeks into the spring selling season, and the preliminary auction clearance rate has fallen below the 70% mark for the first time in 6 weeks.
Sure did. It came in at 69.4% for the past week compared to 71.7% the previous week. It was one of the busiest weekends of the year with 2,400 auctions over the past 7 days. Melbourne hosted 1,000 auctions. Its clearance rate was 68.5%. There's another 1,300 auctions scheduled for this week in that city. Sydney's housing market's preliminary clearance rate came in at 70.6% from 864 auctions. About 1,000 homes are going under the hammer this week. For the last week, Adelaide came in at 82.2%, Brisbane 64.3%, ACT 52.5%. There are more listings than normal, though, with about 42,000 properties going up for sale over the past 4 weeks, well above the long-term average, according to CoreLogic. Good news for buyers, less good news for sellers.
Indeed. And after the show, stick around for an interview you have coming up with Rachel Wastel, who is from financial comparison site Mozo.
Where to get the best deals in terms of home loans, variable rates, fixed rates, as well as deposits and term deposits. With interest rates moving so much and banks and lenders moving on rates, either in anticipation of the Reserve Bank changing things or just because of competition, there's lots of movements going on in terms of what you can get and how much you have to pay. So, well worth a listen.
Yeah, it's a good chat coming up after the show. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has rejected doing a deal with the Greens on legislation to establish an environmental protection authority, even though Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek last week threatened to do so if the coalition refused to help.
The EPA bill is one of the key pieces of legislation the government wants through the Senate this week, but the Greens will not pass it unless the government stops the logging of native forests and inserts a climate trigger into the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. The coalition sees no need for the EPA, regarding it as another layer of bureaucracy, but the miners and big business more broadly are desperate for the coalition to support the bill to avoid the government going to the Greens, according to a report in the Fin Review. Last week, Ms. Plibersek alarmed at business when she said she was talking to both sides and either way was keen to pass the legislation because the EPA was an election promise. Yesterday, the Prime Minister made it pretty clear there'll be no deal with the Greens.
And staying in politics, Sean, Anthony Albanese yesterday expressed frustration with the crossbench and the opposition for hindering his government's legislative goals.
The Senate is sitting this week, but not the House of Reps. That's fairly unusual. Happens once or twice a year. There's likely to be a Barney over housing. Yesterday, Mr. Albanese and Housing Minister Claire O'Neill announced the government's first round of funding under the Housing Australia Future Fund. The money's being provided to build 13,700 homes, and the Prime Minister said it should have come sooner, but for the opposition parties. The Help to Buy scheme seeks to allow the government to contribute up to 40% of the purchase price of a new home, 30% of an existing home for selected applicants. The scheme would be open to 10,000 applicants each financial year, up to a maximum of 40,000 places, and would save buyers from having to take out lenders' mortgage insurance. It can only start operating after states and territories pass laws to support the federal law, so we need to get there, but at least there's some movement there, although the opposition parties aren't necessarily happy with the legislation as it stands.
Now, I reckon this next one is just flat out alarming. There were more data breaches in the first 6 months of 2024 than at any time over the past 3 years, with health service providers most affected, followed by the Australian government.
From January to June this year, the Australian Information Commissioner received 527 data breach notifications, an increase of 9% compared to the previous 6 months. Malicious or criminal attacks accounted for around 2/3 of those. Worryingly, about 30% reflected human error, only 3% was a system fault. The majority, 63% of data breaches, affect 100 or fewer people, though one incident affected over 10 million Australians. Wasn't named. I'm guessing it's the Medisecure one, though. Not really sure about that. Better confirm that at some point. Apart from health and the federal government, finance, education and retail organisations are among the groups that notified most data breaches.
And Sean, precious metals are having a great time of it, with gold hitting a new record yesterday, just under US $2,590 an ounce. Silver jumped 10% last week to $30 an ounce, and both are up 25% this year.
Added the possibility of a 50 basis point cut in the benchmark interest rate in the US this week when the Fed Reserve Board meets, and gold and silver are well and truly on a run. Now, when you invest in gold, you don't get a regular return like a coupon payment. What you do get is safety. So when interest rates look like falling, as they do in the US, gold becomes relatively more attractive because the opportunity cost isn't as great as if you went and invested in bonds and things like that. Hence, that pushes up the price of the precious metal. On the local ASX, gold leader Northern Star Resources share price is up nearly 25% since early July. Evolution Mining is up almost 1/3. Other local stocks to benefit have been West African Resources and Emerald Resources.
Turning to international news now, and Donald Trump was the target of what the FBI said appears to be an attempted assassination at his golf club in Florida yesterday morning, Australian time.
It came 9 weeks after the Republican presidential nominee survived another attempt on his life. Trump said he was safe and well, and authorities held a man in custody. US Secret Service agents stationed a few holes up from where Trump was playing noticed the muzzle of an AK-style rifle sticking through the shrubbery that lines the course, roughly 365 metres away. An agent fired and the gunman dropped the rifle and fled in an SUV, leaving the gun behind along with 2 backpacks, a scope used for aiming, and a GoPro camera. The man was later stopped by law enforcement in a neighbouring county. His name, a 58-year-old called Ryan Wesley Ruth. Apparently, he'd previously tried to recruit Afghan soldiers fleeing the Taliban to fight in Ukraine. Both President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris were briefed on the matter. In a statement, Ms. Harris said that violence has no place in America, saying she was deeply disturbed by what happened.
I mentioned this one at the top of the show, Sean. Some of the side effects of the new range of weight loss drugs, notably vomiting, is taking some of the shine off the so-called wonder drugs.
Yeah, big pharma group Roche's share price dropped 4% after early trial results of its weight loss drug, Hopeful, included high rates of vomiting. In fact, 75% of participants suffered. There were also other side effects. Roche is hoping to push into the rapidly growing market for GLP-1 drugs, which is currently dominated by Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly. At a recent conference in Madrid, about 10% of the 1,100 research abstracts featured GLP-1 drugs, by far the hottest pharmaceutical on the planet at the moment. The downside in all this is that the full impact of the side effects are unknown. GLP-1 based drugs are associated with vomiting, nausea, constipation, particularly in higher doses. They're also linked with muscle wastage in some trials. Now, the US Food and Drug Administration and the European Medicines Agency have explored other more serious side effects reported with recent drugs, such as suicidal thoughts, but they've found no evidence of a link. All these side effects, though, are just taking some of the shine off these so-called wonder drugs.
Finally, Sean, an update on a recent story. Gosh, I love this one. Lucara Diamond Corporation has uncovered a 1,084 carat diamond in Botswana at the same site as it found a 2,942 carat rock last month.
Don't get too excited. I mean, it's about a third the size of that one. In fact, it's about a third of the size of the Cullinan diamond of South Africa, which is the biggest ever found. But this Karowe project, Karowe in Botswana, which Lucara has, it's famous for giant stones. It has done it again.
Oh, it's amazing. And you know what, Sean, while you're away, in fact, I talked about the discovery of that biggest, the big one on the weekend edition when you weren't here. Right. I nominated it as my favourite story. And you know what I suggested? Because obviously the Cullinan diamond is the name of the biggest diamond ever found. I just thought, you know what? It is such an aristocratic name for a diamond. There is an opportunity here for the Lucara Diamond Corporation to unite the world behind what I like to think of as the People's Diamond, this new big rock that was found, and just to give it an everyday down-to-earth name. Like, instead of calling it the Cullinan Diamond, why don't you call it like Doug or
Doug
or Rick?
Jeff.
Yeah, Jeff, Steve, Morton.
Why does it have to be male?
Well, it doesn't have to. They were just the names that came.
Jenny.
Yeah.
Karen.
The Karen Diamond. The Karen Diamond. That will unite the world, Sean.
Yeah, you're right.
Anyway, that is my latest Fear and Greed campaign. Don't know whether it's going to get up.
I'm on it.
We'll give it a crack. Up next is the Fear and Greed daily interview with Rachel Wastel from Mozo.
All about best places to get low home loan rates and best places to get high term deposit rates.
Yeah, it is a really interesting chat. It is coming up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au, and keep an eye on your playlist at around about midday for the next episode of Ask Fear and Greed, where we delve into oil prices and oil names. It's a great one. Thanks very much, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It is Tuesday, the 17th of September, 2024. Make sure you're following the podcast, and please join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, X, TikTok, and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.